holy hell, that was rough. So I'm recording this just a few days after I uploaded Alien Biospheres Part 11, and that has to be definitely not the hardest episode to make, but quite possibly the most annoying, for a whole bunch of different reasons. There are so many things about the episode that didn't go the way I wanted them to. There were so many decisions that I had to make that had no good options, and it was so difficult to think of how best to explain things and how to make the episode flow nicely. I just really was not happy with how it turned out. I mean, at some point I had to just sort of give up and say, it's good enough. But yeah, definitely not one of my favorite episodes. Here's hoping that the next one turns out better. I have actually been looking forward to Part 12 for quite some time now. But for now, I don't even want to think about that. I just want to take it easy and try to recover some of my lost sanity. And speaking of which, by the time this video goes up, I may well have passed 100,000 subscribers. Which, first of all, thank you to everyone watching for being a part of that and to make that milestone possible. But also, I've been so busy thinking about Alien Biospheres that I didn't actually have time to even consider what to do about reaching 100k. I mean, I guess the easiest and simplest thing to do would be to have another Q&A or something, which I could do. But honestly, for right now, the only thing I want to do to celebrate is to not think about Alien Biospheres. So if you have any strong opinions or ideas about what I should do to mark 100,000 subs, leave them in the comments below while I consider what I'm actually going to do. And now, at long last, I can finally afford to think about conlanging again. Thank you also to all of the patrons, and thank you for sticking with me for the 3 or 4 months or however long it's actually been since I've last uploaded. Just when it's an Alien Biospheres month, it's just such an all-consuming project. There isn't really much time to do or think about anything else. So thank you for sticking with me and for giving me the support and motivation to reach 100,000 subscribers. I will continue to do my best to make it worth your while. And now, after our long hiatus, let us resume conlanging. So, as you may or may not remember, when we last left off, we were still trying to figure out paradigms for our nouns as they fit into the different declension patterns. But before we do that, I just wanted to take a probably not so brief interlude to talk about something else that's been on my mind lately. So, for various reasons within the past few days, I've been thinking about valency. And it reminded me to go back and have a look at this system, which we'd made when we were still in the planning phase. And yeah, I was never really 100% sold on the idea, hence why some of it is still in red. But looking back now, yeah, I'm really not vibing with it anymore. So, if you recall, the idea behind this system would be that there are two stems, the active, which is unmarked, and the mediopassive, which I'd roughed in would come from a word that means take or get, which is a pretty common verb to give rise to a passive meaning. And then on top of those two, there would be 3 other affixes. The indicative, which again would be unmarked. Then, here's the weird part, the reciprocal and the reflexive would be marked with the same affix, but whether it was interpreted as a reflexive or a reciprocal would depend whether the verb was in the active or mediopassive. That was always kind of a stretch. Again, that's why I put it in red. But yeah, I don't really like that idea very much anymore. The idea that they're just distinguished based on whether the verb is active or mediopassive, it just seems kind of gimmicky to me and kind of contrived. So I'm going to can that idea. And also, the other thing was that the antipassive and the passive are also marked with the same affix. And again, it just depends on whether the verb is in the active or mediopassive as to which of those you interpret it as. Now, that's not a bad idea on its own, necessarily. Like, a similar sort of thing happens in Ilothwy, where the whip prefix, which basically just means someone or something, can be interpreted as either a passive or an antipassive, depending on if the verb is in the direct or the inverse form. But that's mostly to do with the way that the inverse evolved in Ilothwy, and the fact that Ilothwy has copious object marking, whereas this language does not. And kind of the point of the passive or mediopassive is that we don't care about the agent, and by having this separate ending, that kind of implies that you are required to state the agent in all cases, which again feels a little bit forced to me. So I'm going to can that idea as well. Basically, we're just going to revamp this whole system, because I was thinking over the past few days what I could come up with to replace this. So I did a little bit of reading on the subject and had a sort of a look around to see a cross-linguistic view of how different languages handle these sorts of valency-related matters. And I think I've come up with a system that I like that also has one very controversial aspect to it, which you will see in a little bit. But I would like some feedback on this, because I can't actually tell how strange this is. On one hand, I can totally see it happening, but on the other hand, it does feel very odd. So way back in the olden days of the Protolang, there would have been some sort of indefinite pronoun, something that meant something along the lines of either someone or something. And the only thing in the Protolang that had any kind of equivalence to a passive would be to use this indefinite marker as the subject. So like the closest thing you could get to saying I am seen would be someone sees me. And that's a thing that happens cross-linguistically, that happens occasionally, where you have some sort of dummy pronoun type thing that sort of takes over the role of the subject in what is functionally a passive phrase. Because the whole point of the passive is to background or minimize the relevance of the agent, and that's pretty much exactly what you do by making it indefinite, because we don't care who's doing the seeing here, the important thing is that it happens to me. And then, over time, this pronoun, someone, like the other subject pronouns, gets stuck onto the verb. By the way, I'm not going to bother doing the whole auxiliary verb construction thing just for the sake of clarity, but this someone would ultimately become its own auxiliary verb form. So like we'd have another set of these, another row along the bottom, that was specifically for passive constructions. And then, once that construction gets sort of formalized as basically the passive, that's when some fun things start to happen. So, in this construction, someone sees me. Me is semantically the direct object, because it's the thing that's experienced the seeing from someone. But with word order flexibility, and just the fact that we care more about me than someone, just pretty much by definition of how this construction works, what I'm thinking is going to happen is that me actually gets fronted. It gets dragged forward to the front of the sentence because that's the most important thing. And in that sense, that kind of reminds me of the me gusta construction in Spanish. So like in Spanish, if you wanted to say something like, I don't know, I like cheese, you would not say yo gusto queso, where yo is I, gusto is to like conjugated to agree with the subject, and queso is cheese. That would not be correct. Instead, you say me gusta queso, where the subject is actually in the form of an object pronoun, and gusta actually agrees with queso, which is ostensibly the direct object. And as far as I understand it, the reason why that happens is because gusta actually comes from an older sense of to please, I think, or to satisfy. So the original construction would have been like, cheese pleases me. But I guess for whatever reason in this particular construction, they just paid more attention or put more emphasis on the fact that the pleasing is happening to me, so that resulted in a change of word order. So if that can happen in Spanish, I think we're safe in having it happen here as well. But not only does the patient move up to the front, but also, what I'm thinking is that at this point in the language, cases would already be a thing. So the someone sees me in this case would be marked in what used to be the accusative. So then, once the construction changes around and the me gets brought to the front, it will still be in the accusative. But then, once we have all the shenanigans to do with the converbs evolving from verbal nouns that apply the genitive to their direct objects, and the genitive essentially becomes the new accusative, and what used to be the accusative is now the sort of locative, even once that happens, I think by that point, this me form in the old accusative would have already been reanalyzed as the new subject. So if this was rendered in the new auxiliary construction, it would be like, someone is while seeing me. But I think before that happens, they'll just think about this me as just being the new subject. So even after the change-up happens with the verbs, if they were still interpreting the me as the direct object, then the case marking would change to the genitive. But if they don't do that, then it would stay in the accusative, which becomes the locative. And I think that's kind of cool. It's weird, but I think it makes sense. It's just like a little quirk of this language that when you're doing a passive construction, the subject has to be in the locative. It's just another one of those little things that without a historical explanation, it just comes across as really odd, but it makes perfect sense to me. And also, while we're at it, I think with this someone construction, once someone gets incorporated into the verb, I can absolutely see that being used for all sorts of impersonal type constructions as well. So if you wanted to say something like, it's raining, which in English, the verb demands a subject, so we have to use it, because you can't really say anything else. Like, what does it actually mean there? Like, the sky is raining? The clouds are raining? The weather is raining? Like, none of those really sound right. It just has to be something, so we just use it. But in this case, we could use this particular verb form for that. So, something is raining. Or I guess, raining is happening. Or in any other instance where the subject isn't really necessary to specify. Something like, they say it's going to rain tomorrow. Like, who is they in that sentence? Just kind of people in general, I guess? And again, in English we have to use they for that, but in a language like this, with a specific impersonal verb form, that would be the one that you would naturally use. Now don't worry, I'm not going to make you suffer through watching me spend hours and hours and hours figuring out yet another auxiliary verb, because, ta-da, here's one I made earlier. I was just fiddling around with this a few days ago, so the protoform would have been like hatta, which, running it through all the different auxiliary forms, would give us harat, hatai, hattan, and hatan, which all sound pretty good to me. So let's just go ahead and add those to our auxiliary verb chart. But now, here comes the fun part, because, at least to my mind, with the way this construction works, I don't think it makes very much sense for you to be able to reintroduce the agent. Like, if you wanted to say, I am seen by the man, that would literally be, someone sees me by the man, which I don't think, that doesn't really gel with me. It sounds like the man and the someone are referring to two different entities, which could just be the way I conceptualize these things as an English speaker, but regardless, I'm going to say that with this construction, you are not allowed to restate the agent, which is a thing that happens in plenty of languages. In a lot of languages, if you use the passive, you just cannot make any reference to the agent. Just say, I am seen. That's it. Because again, the whole point of the passive is that we don't care about who's doing the seeing, so why would you even want to restate it? Whereas in other languages, you do have an optional way of restating the agent, just if you want to add in that little tidbit of information, but still keep it de-emphasized. But in this case, no. No reference to the agent at all with this construction. And so, because of that limitation, also in the Protolang, there would have been some form of reflexive construction as well. And initially, that reflexive would have just served purely as a reflexive, but because of the limitation of not being able to refer to the agent in any way when you use this passive construction, the reflexive would gradually begin to move into the status, intrude into the territory of the passive, and it would ultimately become a mediopassive, which again is a reasonably common thing that happens in a lot of languages. Like, there are lots of times in Spanish where you can use the se, reflexive form, in ways that in English we would usually translate it with a passive meaning. And in Nahuatl, at least from the text that I've read, it seems to me that the reflexive prefixes are actually used more often to convey the passive meaning than the actual passive is. So in this case, if you wanted a true passive with no reference to the agent, like I am seen, you would use the someone construction, to me someone sees. But if you wanted to say I am seen by the man, if you wanted to include a reference to the agent, it would be I in the nominative this time, and then see in the reflexive, and then man in whatever case is used to reintroduce the agent, which I'm pretty sure we said was the dative as the default strategy. So I guess it could be literally translated as I see myself to the man, which seems kind of weird, but again, there are lots of languages that work like this. Ancient Greek had a very similar construction with the middle voice, whether or not it's reflexive or passive in meaning just depends on whether or not you state what the agent is. And then, if you cut out the agent, if you don't include the man in the dative, then that has a true reflexive meaning of I see myself. So I think that is quite fun. I enjoy that a lot. Also, I'm pretty sure the reciprocal would be based in some way on the reflexive. It might be ambiguous as to whether or not the reflexive marker could also mean the reciprocal, or the reciprocal could just be marked with extra wording. There are a couple of ways it could be handled, but that's fine. So then the only thing that leaves is the antipassive. And this is where that crazy controversial idea comes in. Because I was thinking about how I want to do the antipassive, because I do definitely want there to be an antipassive in this language, just because I think that would help with the sort of fluidity of the system that we're going for, because I want to be able to use all of these valency operations to jump arguments around all the time, and give us a really nice topic-based syntax. And I was thinking how we might do that, and probably the simplest and most obvious way of doing it would just be to have a separate form for the antipassive, which would be easy enough to do. I mean, you could just incorporate some dummy noun into the verb to sort of demote the object, that's fine. But I was thinking there are a lot of languages where the antipassive and the reflexive have some degree of polysemy. In a lot of languages, they are, in fact, the same marker, and whether or not you interpret it as a reflexive or an antipassive is once again sort of context, or whether or not the object is overtly stated. So if we did that in this language, this construction with the reflexive on the verb, it could either mean I see myself or I see something. Doesn't matter what. Because again, the point of the antipassive is we don't care about what the object is. It's a way of taking a transitive verb and converting it into an intransitive verb by ditching the object, because it doesn't matter. And I was thinking that would be fun, but I'm not sure if that would make sense to do here, because the reflexive is already pretty tied up with a passive meaning. It's moved pretty solidly into the status of being a mediopassive. So it would seem kind of weird for the same marker to convey both a passive-like and an anti-passive-like meaning, while also serving as the reflexive. But therein lies the craziness of my idea. So just like with the passive, in a lot of languages, when you use the antipassive, I see something, it is impossible to restate the object. Because again, we don't care about what the object is, that's why we're using an antipassive construction in the first place. Whereas in other languages with antipassives, you can restate the object in some other form, but in a de-emphasized way. So it's kind of hard to translate this in English because we don't do this, but it would be something like, I see something with general regards to the man, if that makes sense. Like, the fact that it's the man that I'm seeing is not important. That's just a sort of ancillary extra bit of information that we can throw in there if we like. So, my crazy idea is that the way that you would say that in this language would be identical to the mediopassive construction, except instead of using the dative to reintroduce an agent, you use a different case, let's just say for the sake of argument, the genitive, to reintroduce the object. So, I see myself to the man means I'm seen by the man, and I see myself of the man means I see something with general respect to the man. So basically, the way that you tell whether or not the sentence has an active or a passive meaning is just by looking at this case alternation that happens with what is either the agent or the object. Again, it does kind of make sense to me, because if you have this reflexive that's already involved in this valency stuff, that's essentially doing the work of detransitivizing the verb, and that in a lot of languages the reflexive will overlap with either the passive or the antipassive. I just don't know if doing both would be feasible, you know? I don't think I've ever seen that in a natural language where the way that you infer the voice of the sentence is just by looking at the case marking. The only thing I can think of that comes anywhere close to that is actually, once again, Irish, where if you want to say, I see the man, you would literally say, I am at the seeing of the man. Whereas if you passivize that, you would literally say, I am at my seeing by the man. So the only way to tell whether it's an active or a passive meaning is by looking at which argument is marked with the genitive. Whatever the genitive argument is, that's the one that's experiencing the verb. That's kind of similar, I guess? I don't know. Let me know what you think of this idea. Let me know if you've ever seen a natural language do anything like this. I'm still not convinced I'm actually going to go with this, but even if I don't, there are plenty of alternatives that I can think of that I might mess around with. Okay, so I am actually coming back from the future to redo this next part, because I realized I had made a critical error. So you may remember last time I was toying around with the idea of implementing this stress shift, because I was having a lot of difficulty deciding where the stress should be placed in a word after the case markers and gender markers get affixed on. And so to streamline things a bit, I thought I might say that the stress was consistently on the first syllable up until this point, very late in the language, in which stress starts being counted from the right instead of the left. And here I started going ahead with that idea, but it's only now that I realize that I shouldn't do that, because the entire point of giving the locative/dative this particular form is because if the ending is disyllabic, that will drag the stress back, and by so doing, that will affect the patterns of vowel loss later on down the line, and give us more different, more diverse forms. So if you had a root like alchi, to sleep, in the genitive that would be alchisu, with the stress falling on the antepenult, because the penult isn't long or closed. But to get a different pattern of vowel loss, with the locative/dative, that would be alhiura, with the stress now falling on the I, which is the new antepenult. So that needs to happen if we want to have different, very diverse verb forms, which I do. That's something I really want to prioritize, is having the principal parts seem as different from each other as possible. So that being the case, that completely invalidates everything that I've just spent the last hour doing, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to cut that because I don't want to force you guys to just watch me messing around with these forms for something that would ultimately be completely pointless. So let's try this again. Let's have a lightning round of all these forms. So the human singular would be sharewa, with the stress on the antepenult. The I and the W would combine into I, the final A would be lost, the fronting of the initial A would not happen, because that I would not be in stressed or final position at the time. So it would stay as a stressed A, which would then later, due to front vowel harmony, that would back the I into an U, which would then become So, sada. Next, the accusative takes the su ending. Stress is on the antepenult. So, sediwasu. The I and the W would combine into an I. I'm pretty sure that I would then just take over that syllable and just become a long vowel. And in this case, the I would be stressed, so it would front the R, but the R would not be in stressed position. So it would be fronted to E, which would become so it would be sedus. Now, I am thinking maybe I could still implement this stress shift, just without saying that the stress was initial beforehand, just as a sort of way of re-regularizing things. because I imagine we're going to get a fair bit of word final stress for a lot of these, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't know, I will have to think about that idea later. In the meantime, pressing on, in the locative we have hin, anti-penultimate stress, so sadiwa hin, the IW once again becomes y, and that H disappears early on, so that would just reduce down to a long y. Again, it's stressed, so it would front the A. And then finally, for the dative, it would be ura. And very important, we have to say that adding the dative does not remove the final vowel of what it's attached to, because we need that in order to shift the stress. So that would be sadiwaura. And I'm pretty sure that au diphthong would just become a long R. The IW once again becomes U, but now it's not in stressed position anymore, so it could just get swallowed up by the long R, or it could stick around as just a sort of glide type thing. So if the U does get lost, then it would be sadar, but if the U sticks around, I could see it shortening up into a W, saduar. That could linger as a W, and if that happened, then later on, if I remember correctly, yes, W turns into a V when it's bordering an obstruent, so that would actually be sadvar. And once again, I'm tempted by that idea of a secondary stress shift, because, at least to me, having that first syllable closed like that with the coda D, I think that would kind of naturally drag the stress back, so it'd be sadvar. But again, don't have time for that now. Moving on. Now, the duel is built off the singular stem. So now the stress is on the D. Sediwali. First of all, the stressed front vowel will once again front the A. That iwa could become a long U. But then this palatal L, it disappears between vowels, and I think between two U's it would disappear anyway. So we'd essentially end up with an overlong U, which I don't think would last for very long, be reanalyzed as just a regular long U. But later on, word final vowel loss / shortening happens. So that long U will get reduced to just a short U, but it would still receive stress. So, sidi. But of course, we are saying that the dual only comes along later, so now we have to ask ourselves, does adding the dual shift the stress back? Because if the stress is still on the initial syllable, then we probably would get silu. Actually, for the accusative, I don't think it would matter whether the stress was on the I or the A, because in either case, the ua is just going to shorten up into the stressed u. Would be a long vowel, though. And same for the locative as well, because that massive long string of vowels is just going to become e. But for the dative, if we kept the stress where it was, then it would be identical to the singular, except with lu at the end. And then in turn, the final u would front the preceding stressed vowel. And then once vowel harmony happened, that would spread to the initial a as well. But if the stress did shift, then the u would be stressed, not the a. Sadiwauralu. And in that case, I can see the u taking over that sequence, and for the whole thing to once again combine into a long e. But in all other ways, it would stay the same. So really, the main difference would be in the nominative, because if we shift the stress, it would be sedu. If we don't shift the stress, it would be silu. I will continue to ponder that while we move on to the next one. Now, the plural has a different gender marker associated with it. The human plural is agar. And since that's word initial, we once again have to ask ourselves, does that remove the preceding final vowel? Well, if we keep the original vowel around, that will, again, probably give us some more variety. If we say that's shadiagar, then once the voiced velar fricative drops out, it would be iar, which I can just see from the influence of that I, since the I is quite a strong sound and it's stressed. It would just naturally drag the R forward, and eventually the E would just subsume the entire syllable. So sadir. But again, umlaut / vowel harmony, turn the A into an Sadir. If we didn't do that and said that the I was lost, then it would be a sadar. But I'm going to keep sadir for now. And now, by adding the case marker in the accusative, that will shift the stress back onto the A. Oh no, because we've got that RS cluster, it would actually be on the penult. Shadiagarsu. And once again, velar fricative disappears, and I'm pretty sure that A would now be the one to take over the syllable. So what we have here, sadaras, would actually be correct. And once again, with the locative, the H would close that penult, so the A would once again be stressed. And I'd said here that the vowel would shorten before the geminate r, which, yeah, I'll stick with that. But also, final I would front the A, and then front the other A. Sadarin, and the dative would be shadiagarura. Wow, that's a mouthful. And in that case, I think sadara would be correct. The R's would just mesh together into a geminate, the long A would take over the syllable, and then just reduce before the geminate. Okay, so that's all well and good. Now for the animate nouns. Now this is interesting, because if we stick with the pattern we've been going with, which we should, then the gu gender suffix for animate singulars drags that stress back onto the I. So it would be nuriagu. Then the q disappears, but not before lowering the u to an o. So it would be nuriau, which I can only assume would become some sort of diphthong. So that I would remain vocalic. But would that au become a or o? I think it would just become a. But then the u, because this n, I haven't written it here, but this n is actually palatal. So that would front the u to an e, which would then pass a front harmony through the I to the a at the end to get nuria. Interesting. But then as soon as you add a case marker, now the stress gets shifted to the a. Why did I do that in the dual column? That was dumb. So the unstressed I would become a y. The disappearing r would give rise to an aus, which would become as, which would keep the stress, so it would be nurias. But then, front vowel harmony happens. So it would be nuries, but since it's stressed, it becomes an e, which assimilates with a y. So nuris. In the locative, we'd have vowel loss between the h and the uvula, and then the uvula just disappears. And pretty much exactly the same thing would happen like it did in the accusative, except the final consonant would be n. And then in the dative, that long oo would be pretty much guaranteed to just take over that whole bit once the the uvula stop disappears. Oh, wait a minute, no. I was envisioning the vowel harmony spreading from the front, but no, it spreads from the stressed vowel. So in fact, the R would stay as the stressed vowel, and that would actually back the oo, which then become Okay, that's a bit better. Anyway, the dative. So the stressed oo would become a stressed and it would back the initial u to an Cool. Next, the duel. And once again, that's going to depend if we say that the duel shifts the stress back or not. If it doesn't, then the final u would front the preceding u to another e. This, of course, would be after the disappears. And that palatal l would become y, since it will definitely be between vowels. And later the final u will be lost. Nuri. But does the u ever come into contact with the stressed e? It would be nuriau, which could be just shortened to nuriu, which in that case I can imagine the u would assimilate into the e. And again, with the final l becoming y, that wouldn't really affect anything. That would just assimilate into the already extant u. So without any stress shift, it would be nuru. But if there is a stress shift, then the R becomes long and takes over that syllable, the L becomes Y, and the final U fronts the preceding R and then is lost. So it would be nurieu. In the accusative, if the stress isn't shifted, it will remain on the R, but now the final U will front the R to an A. But the SL cluster prevents the U from disappearing, and the S turns into a R between voice segments. But if the stress does shift, now the U is the dominant vowel, which gets fronted to E by the final E, and assimilates into the Y to get nururlu. Much the same in the locative, where if the stress is kept the same, all that really happens between the singular and the dual is that the final U fronts the stressed R to an A, which becomes But if the stress is shifted to the U, that combines with the E and all these other vowels to make a long U, which wouldn't really be affected by the final U anyway. And finally, in the dative, the stress would be on that long U no matter what. and that final U only stresses the vowel that comes before it, which will always be the A, since vowels are never lost between liquids. So nuyuroi would still be correct, which I made a note down here I might shorten up into nuyuri, turn the final diphthong into just an E. Okay, and finally, the animate plural. So now the gender suffix becomes tisi, so the nominative would be nuriatisi. There may or may not be vowel loss between the T and the S, but regardless we're saying the T gets skipped over and softened anyway. The final E fronts the unstressed R to an E, which then drops to and then word final vowel loss gives us nurius. Wow, that was actually right. Except for the fact that that fronted A would receive the stress, so it would raise to an I in stress position and then assimilate with a Y. So it wasn't correct. Never mind. In the accusative, the E would be stressed, which would front the A. Those sibilants would just blend together into a geminate. So it would be nuriaissu, which that stressed I once again, take over the syllable, remove the Y, and you get nurissu. And I don't want to jinx it, but I'm pretty sure that is actually right. And all that same stuff would still happen with the locative. And then very importantly, with the dative, we're saying that the final I sticks around and now receives the stress. Nuriatisiura. The I and the U combine into I, front the previous vowels, and the final A is lost. The T combines with the S and disappears, so it would be nuriarur. Whew, okay. Now that that's over, I'm kind of running out of time, but it's been like 19 and a half years since I've done one of these, so I think we can afford to go a little long if need be, because I really want to get at least one inanimate noun done. And thank God inanimates do not have duels. So I'd already roughed in a word for rock, which is, the go-to inanimate noun. Although it is worth noting that some rocks are animate in Ojibwe and some of the other Algonquin languages, I believe, which I think is pretty cool. And by the way, at this point in the process, when we're starting to actually coin roots, I just start to make a little collection of roots that I like the sound of. Just as and when they occur to me, I just jot them down. And in this case, I just chose the root irnu to mean rock, and just came up with this protoform for it. So the inanimate gender marker is gi. And in inanimates, it's the plurals that are unmarked for number. But by putting the gi at the end, that shifts the stress back onto the first u. So it wouldn't be irnu. That middle u would stick around to be irunu. The only other option would be to say that protoform actually was an RN cluster, because liquids could be coders in the protolang. So adding the gi wouldn't do anything to the stress. And adding case markers on top of that would shift the stress back again onto the second u. Okay, just for the sake of experimentation, running with this initial idea for a second, when the G disappears, the U and the E combine into U, which then fronts the U because it's in final position to irinu. And then word final vowels are lost, so irun. And applying the case marker would move the stress back to the second U, which would still turn into an E, and then the final U would be lost. But now, the Z and the N would come together when the vowels are lost between obstruents and resonants. So it would be irnus. Pretty sure the locative would be the same except with a long E and a final N. And in the dative, the stress now comes on the E, which I don't think would actually change anything, because when the G disappears, it all combines together into one long E anyway. And then word final vowel loss gets rid of the A into an ur ending. And now, just out of curiosity, let's quickly do that again, except with this form. In the nominative, it would be irnu, as I had originally conceived. In the accusative, it would be exactly the same as this other form, and the same with the locative as well. And actually, it would be the same in the dative too. Okay, so the only form that would be different in any way is the nominative. In that case, I'm going to keep this one, because I like how it's less transparent between irun and irnus. Cool, let's go with that then. Oh dear, now we've got to do the singulative. And the singulative was added at the same time as the duel. So we still have to ask ourselves the same question as we did for the duel, as to how that affects stress. So we had said many eons ago that the singulative would come from a root something like sa, We'll make it sa just for the sake of variety. Or actually, we could theoretically make it kya, because kya does the same sort of thing that ya does, where it turns into an S if it's in a cluster, but it turns into y if it's not. Okay, let's try that then. Now, if that doesn't affect the stress, God, I'm so sick of saying that, then it would be pretty similar to the plural, except for the fact that that final kya would stop the u from being lost, and instead the final a would be lost, and that final kya would become y, which would just assimilate into the u anyway. So it would be irunu. But if it does drag the stress back, then it's the second u that will be stressed. Once again, the kya disappears and turns into a y, so it'd just be irnu. I like that, that's cool. For the accusative, no stress shift. Once again, identical, except for an u ending. The stress is on the gi, but now since that su is unstressed, if the vowel is lost between the s and the kya eventually turns into an s in a cluster anyway, so it would result in a geminate s. So it would be irnusse. Okay, the locative, without the stress shift. Now in this case, that final n, once the singulative gets attached, we now have a closed penult, which means it gets the stress, to give us irnunre, which is almost a palindrome. But that's only if the stress shifts. Or actually, no it's not, because even if the stress was still on the nu, that whole sequence just collapses into an u anyway. So yeah, as long as that's just a long u, yeah, that would be the same either way. Cool. And then the last and final form, no stress shift would be inurui, and again, even with the stress shift, that would be the same, because the stress would still fall on the long u. Okay. Blimey. I am desperately hoping that I did all of that correctly, and that I won't have to go back and do this all again. In which case, all that we'll need doing is deciding what to do about whether or not there's a stress shift when the dual and singulative get added. And I will do that in my own time and get back to you in the next episode. And by the way, let me know if what we just did was at all entertaining or interesting, because I was thinking maybe just to speed things up a bit, I could start coining words and going through their declensions in my own time, off air as it were, just so that you don't have to see me struggle to go through each and every single one of these forms every single time. Because I'd be a little bit concerned that if we keep with that pace, this is going to take forever. Unless you just actively like seeing that part of the process for whatever reason. So let me know in the comments below. And I think to close us out, let's make one more example sentence with some of the forms that we've made today. So how about we have the future tense, because we haven't done that yet. How about, the oxen will love the two women on the rocks? Because of course they will. So first up is the subject, which is the oxen. So that's nominative plural, which is nuris. Then comes the auxiliary, which the future tense is form 1 of the auxiliary combined with the second principal part. So form 1 for animate plural is tissa, and then while we're at it, the second principal part of to love is murur, but between the auxiliary and the lexical verb comes the direct object, which are the two women, which in the accusative, thankfully, there's only one form for that. And then on the rocks, we don't yet know how we're doing adpositional phrases, but assuming that we can just use the locative for that, would be the locative plural of rock, and then assuming we're sticking with typical head final syntax, the adpositional phrase will come after the subject. So our final sentence is Nuris irnun tissa sadurlu murur. Again, lots of U's going on. I think that might just be because of the roots we've chosen. It's interesting because every time I start making a language, I have an idea of how I want it to sound, a very nebulous one, but I do have a sort of outline in my mind of what I expect it to sound like, and that informs how I decide what the phonotactics and the phonetic inventory should be. But then when I actually get around to making the words for it, it's always just slightly different than how I expected, and not necessarily in a bad way, just in a way that kind of fills out more completely the outline that I had in my head. if you know what I mean. Anyway, so I think that will about do it for this episode. And to those of you who stuck around all the way to the end, do let me know again what you think about that idea for the passive-anti-passive case alternation thing. And let me know how you feel about doing some of this declension work off-air, what you think about whether or not the dual and/or singulative will pull the stress back, whether or not you think I should implement another stress shift to make sure that everything falls on either the penult or the anti-penult. I admit, things at this point are still pretty messy, but we're still in the very early stages of figuring out all of this stuff, and I expect it will become more streamlined and a lot easier to crack as we go forward. So, I hope that was at least somewhat enjoyable, and hopefully I should be able to get another one of these done relatively soon. And hopefully in that one we can actually start to explore some of our verb morphology. That should be fun. Okay, so thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.